Hello, guys. This is Mr. Cole doing another video lecture for us as we move on through Vietnam. So, with that, this year, this is the only section of our textbook that deals with specifically just 1 year. That is because this 1 year was so tumultuous in American history that it is often nicknamed the year from hell. And that year is 1968. There are more crazy crap that happens in 1968 than I think in almost any year in American history. Maybe other than 2020, what we're going through right now. 1968 is an election year, and election years in our country are always just very, very bizarre years with a lot of tension and things like that. And when you mix Vietnam, you mix election year, and you mix assassinations together, you get a pretty crazy year. So this is 1968, and we're just going to follow it through a timeline of all that went wrong in 1968. We get off to a very bad start in Vietnam in 1968 with an event called the Tet Offensive. The Tet, the word Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. It's January 30th. It's the Vietnamese New Year. And both North and South Vietnam and America agreed that to celebrate Tet, which is a spiritual holiday for the Vietnamese, that there would be a ceasefire on New Year's. Okay? So with this, for the week or so of Tet, there's nobody, fighting going on. Okay? Now with this, because there's no fighting going on, people finally use this time, Vietnamese folks use this time, to finally give proper burial and proper burial rites to their fallen family members. So it was not uncommon to see people, either driving or transporting, coffins and things like that in and out of the cities of Vietnam as proper burials are going on as part of the ceasefire. Well, what Americans did not know in Vietnam was that in some of those areas, as this ceasefire was going on, the Viet Cong were secretly sneaking in weapons and supplies into almost every major city in South Vietnam. Because it was a ceasefire, we didn't stop to check the coffins and things like that, and they're smuggling all sorts of machine guns and things like that into our very cities. The Tet Offensive was a North Vietnamese offensive in 1968 that tried to deal a major blow to American, success in Vietnam. At the exact same time, on the exact same moment, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched surprise attacks on over 12 United States bases, something like 20-something plus cities, including the capital of Saigon, where they actually attacked our embassy in Saigon. Now, the embassy is where the American government was housed at in Vietnam. So where all of our operations were going on at, this embassy is the central symbol of the American presence in Vietnam. They're able to attack that. Here's a picture of the Tet Offensive. You can see all the areas that were all attacked at once at the same moment. Okay, now Saigon is all the way down here. Right there is Saigon. So what they did is the Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia to smuggle in supplies directly into our cities. So you got to think, right up here is the dividing line. This is where the fighting's taking place at, up here. But yet even the capital, this far south, is under attack right now. Here are some of the images from Saigon. This is the American capital in Vietnam that is now the fighting is taking place at. Right? Now, eventually the United States would kind of claim a victory at Tet. None of those bases would eventually be captured. The North Vietnamese would come very close to capturing our embassy. In fact, the fighting was taking place like in the yard of the embassy. But with that, eventually the Americans repel the attack and technically say that they won the Tet Offensive. However, what you really saw happen from the Tet Offensive was a complete change in the way the public viewed the war. They realized that they are being misled, and they also realized that both our commanders in Vietnam and the South Vietnamese government is just not competent, and they do not know how to stop this. If you can walk in and have a full-on battle right outside our embassy, what the heck is going on in Vietnam, right? I mean, that would be like someone walking in and having a battle right in front of the White House on the White House lawn. It's like, whoa, what the heck's going on here, right? Especially when you see some of the aftermath. For example, here's one famous picture that came out of a South Vietnamese army soldiers. This is from our side, just executing a suspected North Vietnamese Viet Cong soldier out in the middle of the street. And images like this and showed really the incompetence of the South Vietnamese government and showed that America really has no idea what is going on in South Vietnam. Before the Tet Offensive, when they looked at polling data, only 28% of the public was against the Vietnam War. However, immediately after Tet, it rose to 40 and basically had a split between those who were in favor and those who were against it. And the media really turns against the Johnson administration. Most famously, Walter Cronkite comes on and gives his own personal editorial, his own personal opinion, something he almost never did in this entire time as CBS News anchor. This is the guy who's nicknamed the most trusted man in America. And he comes out and says, in my opinion, this is an unwinnable war, and that all we can do is try to negotiate a peace and leave. With that, as other media members turn against President Johnson and the Johnson administration, it basically becomes obvious that there is no light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam. That we are either going to have to stick this thing out forever and send even more troops. At this point, we already have 500,000 men there. Or we're going to have to negotiate our way out. Upon hearing this, Lyndon B. Johnson famously said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, then it's over. I've lost the average citizen. Right? And that's kind of the way Johnson viewed this. Here's images of Johnson from the Tet Offensive. And then most famously, one of the really famous pictures that came out after his presidency. This is President Johnson listening. He cleared everybody from the cabinet room. And he asked his son-in-law, so his daughter's husband, who was serving in Vietnam, to have him tell President Johnson exactly what is going on there. Don't give me the political response. I want to know as a family member what it's really like. And this was his describing it. And we don't know what he said to President Johnson, but we know that was President Johnson's reaction to hearing what's really going on in Vietnam. And President Johnson is stuck, right? Now, like I said, it is an election year, and election years get crazy. And Lyndon B. Johnson decides, with all the stress and all the pressure of Vietnam, feeling like he's caught in between pulling American troops out and just leaving South Vietnam for the communists, or putting more American lives at risk by sending more American men in, he's just had enough. And Lyndon B. Johnson makes the just shocking decision to, in 1968, not even run for re-election. Now, this is something that is almost never done in American history. Okay, Johnson had already been elected once, but he had only had to serve out Kennedy's first 1 year left. So under the Constitution, President Johnson was allowed to run for another 4 years, and he chooses not to even try to run. Let me look up real quick the last president to do that. Hold on. That had been since the 1920s with Calvin Coolidge, since someone chosen not to run for re-election. So with this, shocking news from the Democratic Party that their sitting president is not going to run for re-election. So now they have to choose somebody. And the front runner becomes Robert Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's brother, who was his attorney general, by this point was a senator, just like his brother was. And he enters the race and becomes the front runner to win the Democratic nomination. Now with this, on April 4th, 1968, something that we've already learned about, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, and kind of reignited a lot of the racial anger and racial violence in our country. And then to make matters worse, only 2 months later, Robert Kennedy, having just won the California primary, making it look like he was probably going to be the next nominee for president, is also assassinated. At the hotel where he was giving his victory speech, he gives the famous line, "We're on to Chicago," because they were going to go to the Chicago convention to be nominated to be the Democratic nominee for president. He goes off the stage to his left, walks back through a kitchen to go out to his car and out the back door of the hotel, and an assassin was waiting for him. Now, that assassin has nothing to do with Vietnam. The assassin was it was a Middle Eastern dispute about Lebanon and Israel and Palestine, and there's a lot of complicated stuff going on there. But Kennedy was against his cause, and so he decided to assassinate Robert Kennedy. This is the server of the cook there. That's the first one to President Kennedy, or not President Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, as he lay out on the floor dying from his assassination attempt. And with that, 1968 is not going well. We have the Vietnam War turning ugly. We have president quitting. We have Martin Luther King dying. We have Robert Kennedy dying. And I'll let you read this on your own, but it really felt like things were not getting better, right? That everything is going so wrong in 1968. But in our nation's history, we still have elections. And even if a candidate's assassinated, we still have to choose who the president's going to be. So the Democrats really have two different nominees then after Kennedy. They have Hubert Humphrey, who was basically like Lyndon B. Johnson, supportive of the war, versus Eugene McCarthy, who was an outright opponent of the Vietnam War. Well, with the convention in Chicago, because all the voting and stuff, the convention, the Democrats have to choose who to nominate. The traditional Democratic wing chooses Hubert Humphrey. The problem is that sets off the anti-war part of the party. Remember, most of the counterculture folks were young liberal Democrats. And so they get very angry that this pro-Vietnam War candidate was just nominated. So there's all sorts of protests outside of Chicago. Eventually the police move in on the protesters, and the protesters start to riot. And it leads to a crazy riot. There's Hubert Humphrey. Okay. Here are some of the Chicago riots that took place. You can see the aftermath of the Chicago riots are crazy. Blocks and blocks and blocks burned down, and it's all caught on national television. Well, as it's caught on national television, as we get to what we call the general election, the actual presidential election between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, so many Americans are tired of the Democratic leadership. So many Americans are tired of the counterculture and the young anti-war movement that eventually Nixon will win fairly handedly in an election. So Richard Nixon, a Republican, will take over in office and will inherit a mess in Vietnam that he promises he will eventually get us out of if he is chosen. So with that, one of the craziest years in American history, that was 1968. I would also, if you want to look more about Tet Offensive, I posted a video in there for you guys to go and watch. Thanks, guys.